I remember settling into our small two-person tent that evening, feeling both tired and content. It was just my husband and me, tucked away in a secluded part of the woods. We'd spent the entire day hiking, following winding paths and listening to the distant sounds of the forest. By the time we set up camp, exhaustion had set in, the kind that usually guarantees a deep sleep. Sometime past midnight, I stirred awake. The tent was filled with darkness, broken only by the faint silver of moonlight filtering through the thin fabric. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I needed to step outside for a quick bathroom break. It was nothing unusual, just one of those inconvenient moments in the middle of the night. I considered ignoring it, but knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I took care of it. I turned slightly, checking on my husband to make sure I wouldn't disturb him. He was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady, familiar and reassuring. I had just about convinced myself to slip out quietly when a sound broke the stillness. A slow, deliberate scratching, like fingers dragging through the earth. My mind raced. Could have been some curious animal, but there was something too precise about it, too intentional. I held my breath, waiting to hear if it would stop, but it continued. Slowly, I gathered the nerve to ease the tent's zipper open just a fraction. A sliver of moonlight stretched across the forest floor. At first, all I saw were the shadows of bushes and the outlines of towering trees. Then movement. Just a few feet away, a figure crouched low. My eyes adjusted and I made out the shape of a woman. She looked younger than I expected, her hair tangled and hanging in messy clumps around her face. She was so close to our tent, I wondered how she had approached unnoticed. Her hands were in the dirt, scooping out small clumps like she was searching for something buried beneath the soil. Her movements were slow and deliberate, almost trance-like. I held still, my heart pounding. I glanced back at my husband, still unaware of the unsettling scene unfolding just outside our tent. The thought of confronting a stranger in the dead of night left me frozen. For a brief moment, I considered simply zipping the tent closed and pretending I hadn't seen her. But what if she needed help? Or worse, what if she had bad intentions? The thought sent a chill through me. I reached back and nudged my husband awake, whispering that someone was outside. His eyes snapped open, and he immediately turned toward the partially unzipped tent door. Without hesitation, he reached for our flashlight. I crouched low behind him, peering over his shoulder as he aimed the beam toward the figure. The light illuminated her face, streaked with dirt and sweat, her expression distant as if she were barely aware of where she was. "Hey, are you okay?" My husband called out. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly stood, letting the loose dirt fall from her hands. For a moment, I thought she might speak or even react with alarm, but she remained eerily quiet. Then, in one smooth motion, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the dense darkness beyond the trees. Left behind was a shallow hole, inches from our tent. My husband and I exchanged an uneasy look. Part of me wanted to go after her to find out what she had been doing, but common sense told me that was a bad idea. The once peaceful solitude of our campsite now felt stifling, filled with an oppressive silence. We debated what to do, but in the end, exhaustion won out. I still needed to go outside, and I couldn't wait until morning. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent the rest of the way, scanning the trees for any sign of her. The air was colder than before, seeping through my jacket. My husband stood watch, flashlight sweeping the area as I hurried through my task. She was gone, but the feeling of unease lingered. Once back inside, we whispered about what we had just witnessed. A lost hiker? Someone from a nearby campsite? Neither explanation felt quite right. Eventually, fatigue overtook us, and we lay back down. But every rustle of the wind made my skin prickle with the fear that she might return. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the metallic clatter of something outside. My heart leaped. This wasn't a dream. Something or someone was rummaging through our gear. I turned my head and saw my husband was already awake, his eyes wide in the darkness. We didn't speak, just listened to the sound of items being moved around. Carefully, he unzipped the tent and stepped out, flashlight in hand. I followed close behind, my breath catching in my throat, and there she was, the same woman crouched among our belongings. Pots, utensils, and water bottles were scattered around her. She wasn't stealing anything, just examining each item with eerie curiosity, as though our supplies held some secret only she could understand. "Hey, that's ours," my husband said, his voice tense. "Do you need something?" She lifted her head, the flashlight beam catching her face. Her eyes glinted in the light, expression blank. She let a metal cup slip from her grasp, letting it clatter to the ground. She didn't respond, didn't move, just stared. The silence stretched, thick with tension. My mind raced. Was she lost? Confused? Dangerous? My gut told me she wasn't going to respond in any way that made sense. My husband took a slow step back toward the tent, and I did the same. Neither of us wanted a confrontation. We were alone out here, miles from help. If she didn't leave, we had no easy way out. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat felt tight. She dropped back into a crouch, ignoring us as she sifted through our things once more. With no better option, we retreated into the tent and zipped it shut. For a long time, we sat in silence, straining to hear her movements. Eventually, the shuffling outside faded. I let out a slow breath, hoping she had finally gone. But then, the scratching started again, the same slow, methodical digging, now just inches from my head. Without thinking, I yelled for her to stop. The reaction was immediate. A sudden, frantic scuffle, like a startled animal fleeing through the underbrush. I rushed to unzip the tent, but by the time I peered outside, she had vanished. The woods were silent again, save for the whisper of leaves in the breeze. We didn't sleep after that. My husband gripped the flashlight, periodically sweeping it over the tent walls. Every shadow, every sound felt threatening. The forest no longer felt welcoming but oppressive, as though it had closed in around us. At last, dawn arrived, and we cautiously stepped out into the gray morning light. Our campsite was in disarray, gear strewn everywhere, cookware overturned. But the most unsettling thing of all was the hole. It was deeper now, nearly a foot, with no clear purpose. Just a hole dug right beside our tent. We searched the area, but she was gone. No footprints beyond a few smudges of dirt. No sign of another campsite or belongings. Just us, standing in the eerie aftermath of a night that had turned from peaceful to unsettling. We packed up quickly, the urge to leave overwhelming. As we made our way back to the main trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting her to appear again. But she never did. The shadows played tricks at the edges of my vision, but there was nothing there. That trip left me shaken in a way that storms or wild animals never had. Because when it's another person acting strangely in the middle of the wilderness, you can't predict what they'll do. The unknown lingers, slipping beneath your skin, reminding you just how fragile the feeling of safety truly is. I still remember the way the fire crackled that night, sending restless shadows dancing across our campsite. My parents were chatting with some fellow campers, trading stories about good fishing spots and the best ways to keep raccoons away from food. Meanwhile, I was growing antsy. My friend and I caught each other's gaze across the flames, and I knew exactly what was on his mind. It was time for one of our late-night walks. Back then, I was so sure of myself. I'd spent almost every summer camping and believed I understood the woods like the back of my hand. What animals came out after sunset, which trails looped back around, how far I could go without losing my way. But something about that night felt different. There was a whisper of unease tugging at me, though I brushed it off. Maybe it was the way the moon disappeared behind thick clouds, or how the woods beyond our campsite seemed darker than usual, like the trees had drawn closer. Whatever it was, my certainty wavered, but my pride wouldn't let me back down. I nodded toward my friend, and we slipped away into the night. There's a special kind of thrill in stepping beyond the glow of a fire and into near-complete darkness. Twigs snapped under our shoes, and the scent of damp earth clung to the air like an unspoken warning we chose to ignore. Normally, we stuck close enough to see the faint flicker of our campfire through the trees, But that night, we decided to push a little further, see how deep we could go. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. You'd expect the woods to be alive with the chirping of crickets and rustling of nocturnal creatures, but the silence was thick, unnatural. It pressed into my ears, making every small sound, a shifting leaf, a breaking twig, feel louder than it should. My friend and I exchanged nervous smiles, but there was an edge to them. We scanned the darkness between the trees, half expecting something to materialize. After a while, I realized we'd wandered further than we ever had before. I turned to check for the reassuring glow of our fire, but there was nothing, just shifting shadows. That's when I first heard it. A whisper, low and close, as if someone was speaking just behind me. My body tensed. My friend flicked his flashlight on, the beam slicing through the blackness as we spun around, searching. Nothing, just trees gnarled and ancient, fallen branches, no figures, no faces. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, except there was no wind that night. The air was still and heavy. We stood there, listening to the sound of our own breathing, before finally clicking the light off again. We weren't about to let our nerves ruin our adventure. Still, we picked up the pace. Maybe it was time to head back. I made a weak joke about being paranoid, but my friend didn't laugh. He just kept glancing behind us like he expected something to emerge from the darkness. And then another whisper, this time clearer. Not words exactly, just a sound like a sentence half-formed but never finished. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. We froze. Run back to camp? Stay and see? Fear battled curiosity. And for the first time, it hit me. If we'd misjudged our location, we could be lost. That realization sent a cold spike of panic through me. I nudged my friend, and without speaking, we turned back the way we had come. But everything looked different now. The familiar landscape had twisted into something unfamiliar. Every tree seemed strange, every shadow a hidden threat. And then it dawned on me, we weren't hearing normal night sounds. We weren't hearing anything natural at all. There was something else out here making those whispers, something with a voice, and it didn't sound like another camper. We walked faster. My flashlight trembled in my grip. Every step sounded too loud, too obvious. My friend met my eyes, and in his stare, I saw the same mix of fear and stubborn resolve. We weren't running yet, but deep down we wanted to. Branches snagged at our sleeves. The silence of the forest felt like it was holding its breath. And then another whisper, closer this time. I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. My friend and I stopped dead in our tracks. One look at each other and we knew we were done. Whatever was out here, we didn't want to meet it. This time, we didn't hesitate. We switched our lights back on and swept the area with our beams. My throat was dry. I just wanted to see something familiar, anything to reassure me we were heading in the right direction. But all I saw was more trees, more darkness. A deep, sinking feeling settled in my gut. It wasn't just the fear of being lost. It was the awful certainty that something was watching us. I grabbed my friend's arm and we moved faster. We needed to get back to the safety of our fire, to the warmth of our families. But a part of me knew, even if we found our way home, this night wouldn't leave us so easily. Something had changed. The woods had made sure we wouldn't forget. By the time we decided we couldn't push our luck any further, the darkness felt almost suffocating. We forced ourselves to keep moving, each step echoing like a warning in the silence. Even though we were together, I felt like an intruder in a place we weren't meant to be. I raised my flashlight, heart hammering. A shape flickered at the edge of the beam, something hunched, low to the ground. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My friend saw it too, his fingers dug into my arm. The figure crawled through the leaves, tattered clothing dragging behind it. My mind couldn't decide, human or animal. The posture was wrong. And then a voice, broken and strange, spilled from its lips. My friend lifted his flashlight. The beam caught her face. A woman, her eyes wild, her skin streaked with dirt. She swayed as she muttered something about looking for her campsite. Something about her felt wrong, but she seemed lost, and we couldn't just leave her. We hesitated before offering to help. Supporting her, we made our way back. She mumbled nonsense. A name, numbers, half-finished sentences. Every so often, she'd stop and scan the darkness, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge. And I found myself looking, too. At last, the trees thinned. A flicker of orange appeared through the gaps. Camp. Relief flooded me, but unease lingered. When we stumbled out of the woods, a group near a dying fire noticed us. One of them stood, slurring about how the woman had wandered off after drinking. They seemed clueless about how long she had been gone. We settled her onto a log, but the group barely reacted, just muttered thanks and returned to their quiet conversation. No questions about how lost she had been or the eerie journey through the trees. Just a shrug, like it didn't matter. My friend and I walked away, still shaken. Everything about our own campsite, the laughter, the fire's glow, felt like a comfort we'd never really appreciated before. I kept replaying the moment we saw her crawling through the dark. If we had taken a different path, if we had left even a minute earlier, we might never have found her at all. We barely spoke as we returned to our tents. The woods seemed calmer near the camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Even in the safety of our familiar surroundings, I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting another figure to emerge from the shadows. That night, as I lay awake, I swore I could still hear them, the whispers, waiting for the next pair of kids reckless enough to stray too far from the light. I've been camping for years, but there's one trip that still makes me question how safe we really are in the wilderness. My wife and I had picked a remote spot, famous for its towering pine trees, expecting a peaceful escape. The drive felt routine, dusty back roads, a few deer darting past our headlights, the usual quiet of deep woods. But as soon as we stepped out of the car, something felt off. Too quiet. No rustling, no birds, just a heavy, unnatural stillness. We set up camp beneath a cluster of gnarled trees, the ground soft with layers of old needles. The sky was dull gray that afternoon, and the occasional cool breeze made us glance around as if expecting company. I brushed off the creeping unease. After all, we came for solitude. But as the day wore on, that breeze turned into something fierce. By dusk, the wind howled against the trees, whistling in a way that made it seem alive. My wife shot me a worried look. I acted calm, poking at the fire to keep our spirits up. Overhead, the clouds churned into a restless swirl, and the branches above us groaned. Each snap of wood felt like an alarm bell, making us peer up, wondering which tree might come crashing down first. Night fell fast, swallowing any sense of security. We crawled into the tent, only to hear a deafening crack from somewhere beyond the fire's dying glow. A massive thud followed, rattling the ground beneath us. The wind slammed against our tent so violently I feared the whole thing might be ripped apart. With each gust, I braced myself, half expecting a branch to come crashing down. The forest felt hostile, like it was rejecting us. Then, in the chaos, I was certain I heard footsteps outside, light, hesitant, as if someone was picking their way through the fallen debris. My wife whispered my name, voice unsteady. I pretended I hadn't noticed. There was no way I was stepping out to check. Every sound beyond our thin nylon walls made it seem like the whole world was unraveling. When dawn finally came, it revealed a battlefield of broken branches, our fire pit nearly buried under fallen limbs. We were lucky our tent hadn't been crushed. As we packed up, I spotted fresh footprints in the mud, ones that didn't match our boots. Not wanting to spook my wife, I shrugged it off as a trick of the light and urged her to hurry. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something or someone. After that storm, I figured a trip with a buddy would be less intense. We'd heard about an old campsite only reachable by a rugged back road. Supposedly, it had a couple of crumbling picnic tables, a rusted fire ring, and 2 weathered outhouses that hadn't been checked in years. That alone should have been a warning, but we wanted adventure. We arrived around midday, kicking up dust as we veered onto the rough path. The place was deserted, no signs of recent visitors, no tire tracks. We unpacked, joked about who would get tetanus first, then got to work setting up. My friend wandered toward the first outhouse but came back looking uneasy. He didn't say much, just moved on to the second. When he finished, he simply said, "You need to see what's in there." Bracing for some disgusting mess, I stepped inside. Instead, I found 3 massive backpacks, coated in a thin layer of dust. 2 were packed with the usual camping gear, sleeping bags, flashlights, fuel canisters. But the third, it was filled, top to bottom, with candy. Skittles, to be exact. Dozens of bags, big and small, crammed into every pocket. The sheer amount was unsettling. For days passed, and no one showed up to claim them. No other campers, not a single vehicle. At night, the silence pressed in, making us uneasy. A few times, I thought I heard twigs snapping outside, but every time I checked, nothing was there. My buddy swore he heard whispering. We blamed our nerves, but something felt wrong. When we finally left, we didn't dare take the bags with us. Felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to disturb them. We let the authorities know, but I doubt they rushed out there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it connected to the storm trip, like there was a pattern I wasn't seeing. As we drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be watching us from the trees. Hoping to clear my head, I set out on a solo camping trip with my dog. No wild weather, no abandoned backpacks. Just me, my dog, and a stretch of quiet forest. The drive was uneventful, the sun already setting by the time I found a decent spot. I kept things simple: a tarp shelter, a small fire. My dog curled up at my feet as dusk settled in. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, the distant murmur of a creek adding to the peace. But I couldn't relax. My mind kept drifting back to those strange, unexplainable moments from the past trips. Just as sleep started to take hold, I saw headlights weaving through the trees. A second later, a truck engine roared, way too loud. Voices followed, drunken and rowdy. My heart pounded as my dog's ears perked up. Then, gunshots, loud, reckless, echoing through the night. My breath hitched. Were they just messing around? Or did they know I was here? The landscape sloped in a way that made stray bullets a real danger. I couldn't risk staying put. My first priority? Kill the fire. The last thing I needed was for my flickering flames to advertise my location. I stomped out the embers, grabbed my essentials, and tightened my dog's leash. We needed to get out of there, fast. Moving through the forest was nerve-wracking. Every step on dry leaves and twigs felt impossibly loud. A small, irrational part of me feared I'd stumble across fresh footprints, like the ones after the storm. But another gunshot cut through my thoughts, pushing me forward. My heart hammered as we weaved through the trees, crouching low whenever another round fired off. My mind raced. Was this just bad luck? Or was there a connection between the storm, and the abandoned gear? Eventually, I found a rough path leading away from the chaos. The gunshots faded into the distance, replaced only by my ragged breathing. I don't know how far I walked, but by the time I reached a service road, I was exhausted. My dog stayed glued to my side, as if sharing my relief. The night was silent again, unnaturally so. It reminded me of that first eerie stillness, right before the storm. As I caught my breath, my flashlight beam flickered over the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, someone standing just at the edge of the light. I froze, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Part of me wanted to find a motel and forget the whole thing. But another part, the part tangled in unease, felt drawn to understanding why these things kept happening. Was I imagining connections where there were none? Or was something out here, threading these events together in ways I couldn't comprehend? I climbed into my car, hands gripping the wheel tight. The wind whispered through the trees. My pulse pounded in my ears. I told myself it was just drunk hunters, just bad luck. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, and I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe in the woods again until I found out what. I should have realized something was wrong the moment we turned onto that narrow dirt road. The main camping area had been crowded, lanterns glowing, voices carrying over crackling bonfires, and I had hoped we'd find a quieter spot just a little farther out. Well, we certainly found quiet, but I don't think it was the kind we wanted. By the time we climbed out of the car, the sun had long since disappeared, and my phone's flashlight barely lit up the cramped, uneven pull-off. My boyfriend shot me a look that said, "This is the best we've got," while our friend, a mix of nervous energy and excitement, scanned the dark treeline, maybe wondering if picking the most isolated spot was a mistake. I shrugged like it didn't matter, but I had this uneasy feeling in my stomach, the kind that hinted things were about to get weird. Still, we got to work. The three of us fumbled with our tents, our flashlight beams zigzagging through the thick night. At one point, I jabbed my hand on a tent stake and muttered a few choice words under my breath. Meanwhile, every time a twig snapped, we froze, staring into the shadows. The silence was oppressive, almost like the whole forest had stopped making noise on purpose. Each time the wind stirred the trees, a chill ran up my spine. Once we got both tents set up, we started a small fire, just enough to cook some hot dogs and keep our nerves from dipping too low. The orange flames flickered across our faces, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to stretch higher than they should. My boyfriend forced a grin, trying to hide his unease, while our friend told a half-hearted story about some local ghost legend she'd heard. The usual kind, mysterious sightings, missing hikers, but something about hearing it here, surrounded by absolute blackness, made it hit differently. As we talked, our voices seemed to disappear faster than they should, swallowed by the night before they had a chance to echo. I tried to push away the creeping thought that maybe there was a reason this part of the campground was empty. We stayed close to the fire, stealing glances over our shoulders whenever the underbrush rustled. Despite our efforts to laugh it off, I think we were all itching to get inside our tents and hope the night passed without incident. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers. We poured some water over it, watching the last glow vanish before hurrying to our tents. My boyfriend and me in one, our friend in the other. Before zipping up, I swept my flashlight over the area one last time. Trees, gravel, the faint outline of the lake beyond. Normal stuff, but my stomach was twisted in knots, and I had no idea why. As I settled into my sleeping bag, I told myself this was just another night outdoors. Let the woods do their thing, and everything would be fine by morning. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come fast. Little did I know that was just the beginning. The real fear was waiting for us, lurking in the darkness beyond that final dying ember. Sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake. My thoughts were sluggish, my body stiff from lying on the rough ground. At first, I thought I was just hearing my own breathing too loudly, but then a sound cut through the silence. A long, wavering cry, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a coyote, not an owl. Something about it made my pulse spike. My boyfriend stirred beside me, clutching my arm. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The way it echoed through the trees felt almost deliberate, like a signal. I muttered something about it probably being just a passing creature, though the words tasted like a lie. The howling stopped, leaving a silence so deep it felt unnatural, like the forest itself was waiting to see how we'd react. Minutes stretched. My boyfriend and I lay frozen, straining to hear the next sign of life. When none came, we gradually relaxed. I focused on the soft rustling of our sleeping bags, the quiet breathing from our friend's tent. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy. Then came the scraping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind dragging a branch across gravel, but it had a rhythm, slow, deliberate, like footsteps, crunching on the rocks, getting closer, then farther, then closer again. My heart pounded. I convinced myself it was just our friend, stepping outside for a bathroom break. She'd been nervous about going alone. I called her name, just loud enough to be heard. No answer. I should have checked, but I didn't. Instead, I lay still, forcing myself to believe it was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out. Not for long, though. I woke again to a faint glow outside the tent walls. At first, I felt relieved, assuming dawn had finally arrived. But when I checked my phone, it was barely past 3 a.m. The light felt real, but when I peeked through a gap in the zipper, the woods outside were still cloaked in darkness, like the glow was coming from nowhere. Beside me, my boyfriend mumbled about nightmares, something about shifting figures in the trees. Half dream, half lingering fear from that awful howl. The night felt wrong. I tried to reassure him, told him we'd laugh about this in the morning. But that eerie feeling wouldn't leave my skin. Then, the final horror. I woke up feeling something pressing against the bottom of my sleeping bag. A weight, right over my feet. For a second, I thought I was still dreaming. But then I felt the fabric of the tent bending inward. Something was outside, pushing down. Panic surged through me. I kicked, flailed, screamed. My own voice so raw I barely recognized it. My boyfriend shot up, gripping my arms, trying to calm me, but I couldn't stop. I kept thrashing until, suddenly, it was gone. Silence, complete and suffocating. I gasped for air, hands shaking, waiting for something. Footsteps, a growl, a zipper sliding open, but nothing happened. My phone read 4:25 a.m. Our friend must have heard me losing it, so we braced ourselves to check on her. We listened. No movement outside. When I finally unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight out, there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of anything, just the other tent, still zipped, and the looming trees swallowing everything beyond. I rushed to our friend's tent. She peeked out, pale, terrified, but unharmed. She swore she hadn't left her tent all night. So if it wasn't her, who had been walking around? What had pressed against my tent? We didn't wait to find out. Within minutes, we were tearing down our tents, stuffing sleeping bags into their sacks with shaky hands. Every tiny noise in the underbrush made us flinch. By 4:40 a.m., we were packed. We bolted to the car, dumped everything in a heap, and peeled out of there. As the headlights cut across the empty campsite, the trees seemed to shift just out of sight, the shadows stretching in ways that didn't feel right. We didn't breathe easy until we hit the main road, where distant streetlights promised a return to normal. But even as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of that pressure on my feet, the howling, the slow, creeping footsteps circling our tents. We left that place behind, but I know without a doubt that whatever was out there, it never left us. By the time I reached that valley in the late afternoon, I was determined to leave behind the stress of deadlines and the endless buzz of notifications. The stillness out there was almost intoxicating. No phone signal, no crowded camping spots, just the occasional bird call breaking the silence. My plan was simple: set up camp before nightfall and enjoy some well-earned peace. But, as always, I misjudged my timing on the trail. The sun was sinking faster than I expected, its amber glow barely casting enough light to guide my way. That's when I noticed someone on the path ahead. He greeted me like it was the most normal thing in the world to run into someone in the middle of nowhere. I can't explain why, but there was something easygoing about him that put me at ease. He asked if I was looking for a camping spot, then gestured toward a hidden clearing near the river. The way he described it, close to the road but invisible to most passersby, piqued my curiosity. A small part of me wanted to ask why it had to be so well hidden, but I decided to let it go. Maybe I was just too grateful for the tip to question it. We walked through thick brush, branches seeming to close behind us. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see a trail, but it was just shadows and tangled undergrowth. Finally, he pointed out the spot: a fire pit with weathered stones, a space just big enough for my truck, and the steady murmur of the river close by. He gave me a nod, mentioned that I'd probably have the whole area to myself, then disappeared as quickly as he'd arrived. At first, the place felt like a hidden gem, like I had stumbled into a secret world. The sky was streaked with pink and violet as I built a fire before darkness fully set in. The flames crackled as I fed them small sticks, the warmth licking at my face in the cooling air. I settled into a chair, popped open a beer, and, out of habit, checked my phone, only to chuckle when I remembered I had no service here. The night took over fast. I put on a comedy podcast, letting the familiar voices echo through the trees. I knew it probably wasn't smart to make noise out here, but the laughter made the vast silence feel less heavy. With no one around to tell me otherwise, I leaned back and let the volume rise. Maybe I was a little too comfortable in my solitude. By the time I realized how late it was, the fire cast long, flickering shadows across my camp like outstretched arms. I considered setting up my tent, but exhaustion won out. The thought of fumbling with poles in the dark sounded miserable, and the covered bed of my truck seemed like a much easier option. I tossed my gear inside, laid out a makeshift bed, and imagined waking up refreshed for a slow morning by the river. Even as I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the awareness that the night felt deeper than usual. Every snap of a twig made me wonder if a raccoon or something else was nearby. I told myself it was just the thrill of being alone, but I kept glancing at the shifting darkness outside the truck windows. Sleep eventually found me, though it was uneasy. The wind stirred the underbrush, making the branches tremble in the fading glow of the fire. In my half-conscious state, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been listening to the voices coming from my speaker. At one point, I sat up and peered outside. All I saw were the silhouettes of trees swaying in the ember light. I told myself I was just being paranoid and finally drifted off for good. The fire burned down to a cluster of dim coals, and the world outside faded into ink-black silence. I didn't know it yet, but that unsettled feeling would become all too real in the morning. I woke to the crisp bite of dawn air, blinking awake in the back of my truck. My muscles ached from the hard surface, but at least I was warm. Groggily, I gathered some kindling and rekindled the fire, coaxing it into strong flames to heat up a quick breakfast. My plan was simple: enjoy the soft morning light, maybe crack open a beer, then slowly pack up and head back to civilization. I had just settled into my camp chair when I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. At first, I assumed it was just a curious animal nosing around for scraps, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person. A tall, ragged figure nearly swallowed by layers of dirty clothes and bags. Plastic grocery bags, dozens of them, were tied around his arms and torso like strange, rustling streamers. My brain started replaying every warning I'd ever heard about drifters in remote places. He didn't speak, didn't look at me. He just hovered near the edge of my campsite, shuffling side to side like he couldn't decide whether to step closer or fade back into the trees. Something was off. I raised a hand in greeting. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice steady. No response, just more of that slow, hesitant pacing. Felt like a standoff, though I tried not to let it show. I offered him breakfast, thinking maybe a hot meal would settle whatever was going on. He took a couple of steps closer, the plastic bags whispering with each movement, but he never faced me, never looked directly at me. The way he kept his back turned made my skin crawl. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. I kept my bear spray and knife within reach, hoping I wouldn't have to use them. Maybe he was just lost. Maybe he was hungry. I tried again, offering him a beer this time. Still nothing. He didn't even acknowledge my words. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to stop paying attention. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. My frustration flared. "Acknowledge me or leave," I finally snapped, my voice cracking with the mix of unease and anger. For the first time, he reacted. Not with words, but by slowly slumping, then turning away. Without a sound, he shuffled back into the trees, vanishing the same way he'd arrived. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse hammering, then snapped into motion. Forget breakfast. Forget relaxing. I stomped out the fire, threw my gear into the truck, and fumbled to start the engine. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the image of him lurking in the shadows, waiting, watching. As I sped down the gravel road, relief washed over me, but I didn't truly feel safe until miles stretched between me and that valley. Even then, my thoughts wouldn't settle. Had he been there all night? Had he stood beyond the firelight, listening as I laughed at my podcast, sipped my beer, completely unaware of his presence. The idea made my skin crawl. I almost thanked my own laziness for not setting up a tent that night. Those truck walls had given me a barrier between me and whatever that man had wanted. Even now, I don't know what his intentions were. All I know is it was best I didn't stick around to find out. The morning started at my buddy's house. The storm from the night before had finally passed, but the air outside still felt strange. It wasn't just leftover moisture either. It was more like a low, buzzing pressure that made my skin crawl. We were supposed to be pumped about heading into the woods, but I noticed everyone moving sluggishly around the living room. I pushed aside my unease, figuring I was just picking up on someone else's nerves. Eventually, we trudged outside to pack up the ATVs. 2 of them, each pulling a small trailer crammed with tents, water jugs, and random supplies. We'd done trips like this plenty of times, but the quiet hanging over the group felt off. Normally, we'd be cracking jokes and making a racket, but instead, we just fumbled with straps and checked the engines in near silence. Then, without a word, we set off. The first few minutes on the muddy trail felt like stepping into another world. The forest around us was eerily still. No birds singing, no rustling in the underbrush. Just the growl of our engines and the wet squish of tires in the mud. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching us, but I kept it to myself. No one else was talking, and I didn't want to be the one to say something dumb. A couple of miles in, we stopped for a break near an old, leaning tree stump. The heavy air pressed down on me, and I leaned against one of the trailers, catching my breath. That's when something darted across the trail a short distance ahead. Maybe it was a deer, I told myself, but it moved too fast and too upright. My friend's face paled, but he shook it off just as quickly. I think we all felt it, like we'd just seen something that didn't quite fit into a normal day. Still, we climbed back on and kept going. Fallen branches and deep, slick ruts slowed us down, forcing us to take more detours than I could count. Even the daylight seemed to fade faster than it should have, making the woods look darker, like the day itself was trying to slip away. Every time we cut the engines to figure out a new route, the silence around us felt suffocating. A few times, I thought I heard faint snaps in the underbrush, but when I turned, all I saw were damp leaves and twisted tree trunks. By the time we reached our campsite, my shirt was clinging to my back, and my heart was beating too fast. The whole ride had felt wrong, but I had no idea just how much stranger things were about to get. As we dragged our gear into the small clearing, the daylight was already fading. It felt like walking into a space where something unseen was waiting. We spread out, trying to find solid ground for our tents, exchanging uneasy looks whenever a twig cracked or a breeze stirred the trees overhead. The air was thick and sticky, clinging to our skin, and the unnatural silence made my stomach twist. Not a single bird call, no rustling of small animals. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. We were drained from the trip, but no one suggested heading back. Instead, we hurried to set up. I drove tent stakes into the damp ground with shaky hands while the others scattered to gather firewood. The plan was to get a fire going fast, hoping it would chase off the strange feeling that had been hanging over us all day. At first, I thought the tall figure standing among the trees was just another oddly shaped trunk, thin, stretched, and blending into the dimming light. But then it moved. I saw it past my half-finished tent, looming with an eerie stillness. One of my friends saw it too. His voice cracked in the middle of a laugh when he noticed it. We all froze, waiting for it to do something, anything, but it just stood there. And then, before I could process it, it shot back into the woods, moving in a way that wasn't right. We clustered near the fire pit, our eyes darting around the darkening forest. When the first flames caught, it was like a jolt of relief, but the flickering light twisted the shadows, making them dance at the edges of our vision. Shapes seemed to shift just beyond the fire's reach. Every tiny sound beyond our circle of light had me gripping my knees, ready to run if something too big came crashing through the brush. Night fell too quickly, knotting my stomach with dread. I realized there was no turning back. Navigating the mud and tangled undergrowth in pitch darkness would be a nightmare. We huddled close to the fire, too rattled to tell our usual ghost stories. Instead, we kept scanning the trees, convinced we'd see that towering figure creeping closer. At one point, I swore I heard a soft crunch nearby, but when I turned, all I saw was the endless sprawl of trees and shadows. We agreed to take turns keeping watch while the rest of us tried to sleep. Not that rest seemed possible. I crawled into my tent, heart pounding in my ears. The dim lantern glow inside made my sweaty hands look even paler. I lay there, straining to hear anything unusual. Every so often, someone near the fire would call out, just to make sure we were all still there. The worst part was the silence between those check-ins. Every pause made me picture that figure creeping closer, step by step. Somehow, the night dragged on without any full-blown terror. At first light, we tore down camp like our lives depended on it. Sleep or no sleep, we just wanted to be gone. The tension broke the moment we loaded up the trailers again. The sky was a dull, cloudy gray, but to me, it felt like the brightest sunlight I'd ever seen. We didn't talk much about what had happened. We just pointed our ATVs toward home and left. On the ride out, my eyes kept flicking to the trees, searching for anything out of place. Every so often, I thought I saw something tall and gangly lingering in the shadows, and my pulse would spike. But nothing ran across our path. No shapes loomed between the trunks. It was almost like the forest had decided to keep its secrets now that we were leaving. When we finally pulled into my buddy's driveway, I swear I could taste the relief in the air. We unloaded in thick, awkward silence. No one was ready to put into words what we'd seen. Even later, when the shock wore off, we only tossed around half-serious explanations. But deep down, I knew our trip hadn't been just another camping adventure. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't care if we want answers. All we can do is pack up and hope it lets us go.